A big welcome to our live audience for the Digital Health Investor Talk Show. I'm your host, Stephen Wardell. I'm the managing partner of Wardell Advisors, a digital health advisory firm, and the author of The Future of Digital Health. Wardell Advisors is helping digital health companies address issues around growth, fundraising, trade sales, and strategic alternatives, giving you more options in today's challenging environment. Excuse me. You can follow me at x.com/Stephen Wardell. Our show today is on the topic of the revolution in obesity care. New therapies are shaking up the super category of obesity and diabetes care, but it's not enough to just take a drug. And my guest is Sloan Saunders, founder and CEO of Flight Health, a leader in obesity care. This show is being recorded and will be included in my podcast series called Digital Health Investor Talk. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple and Spotify and leave us a review. We always love getting 5-star reviews. We have a new podcast link for the show, so make sure that you see a recent episode when you subscribe, or you could be subscribing to the old show pages. This is not investment advice, and we are not investment advisors. Here's the format of today's show. It's 90 minutes long, and Sloan and I will spend the first part discussing the news and the macro picture and other topics. And then for the second part, we'll focus on our special topic of the day. And we'll be taking your questions throughout in the LinkedIn text chat. So feel free to ask questions in the chat. So welcome to the show, Sloan, and please introduce yourself to our audience.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Steve. I'm Sloan Saunders. I'm co-founder, CEO of Flight Health. We're a tech-enabled virtual cardiometabolic care company.
That's great. Thank you. Well, so we'll move on to our first topic of the day, which is macro news. This is where we talk about index levels and inflation and interest rates and jobs and unemployment and what it means for the next few months and the next year for the innovation economy. And the innovation economy that we focus on is the digital health innovation economy of young digital health companies, their leaders, and the investors who back them. So I'll just mention that I think unexpectedly, the NASDAQ is now up to 20,700. And so I know there's been a lot of jitters. There's long been thoughts that the NASDAQ's got to pull in. There's also been concerns that Trump's tariff war is going to lead to multiple different kinds of real economic impacts. But the NASDAQ is up. This is record high territory. And as I sometimes point out to the chagrin of me and my friends, that 2.5 years ago, if all you had done was put your money in the NASDAQ, everyone would think that you're a stock market genius today. The NASDAQ is up over 100% in that time. And people thought it was high 2.5 years ago. So that's the market indices. And then I think yesterday, the CPI for June came out, and it was 2.7%. And that was a little higher than expected, and it was higher than May, which was 2.4%. Both of these are below 3%, which I think is the goal of both the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Fed. They'd like to see it definitely below 3%. And the small step up, which is concerning, is being attributed to tariffs. It's not clear. That's a controversy. It's not clear if that's the obvious thing in the room. And then we also have the last time the Fed had a chance to lower rates. I think that many market participants, including the innovation economy, want to see lower rates. We think that's a predecessor to some return to normalcy in our sector. But the Fed said, no, we're not cutting rates because somebody's got to be riding inflation and concerned about inflation, and that's us, the Fed. And so they attributed, despite some indicators they could have cut rates, they said we're not cutting rates, partly based on what Trump has done and also based on what Trump has said he's going to do about tariffs as well. So anyway, so that's the NASDAQ and CPI. Do you follow these, or do you have any favorite numbers? What do you think?
No, I think those are good metrics to focus on. A lot of our initial attention is focused on, I would say, more local healthcare and economic sort of impact. But obviously, most recently with Trump even evaluating Jerome and sort of what he's doing, it's an interesting climate to navigate.
Yeah, one of the things Trump has brought us is much higher drama in the news, in politics. And just odd things. I remember from the first term that Trump would get into a public fight with a cabinet member. And this literally had never happened before. But people went to great lengths to smooth over, keep any discord behind closed doors. The administration presents a solid united front. And Trump got into a fight with cabinet members. And the Fed is very distinct from a cabinet member, but Trump also got into a fight with the Fed last term and this term. So I think, but to my surprise, today in the news, he said that he was not going to try to fire. And in theory, the president also can't fire the chairman of a Fed member. What they do is they could not renew their term if their term happens to come up during that president's administration. Um, but he's saying he's not going to fire the chairman of the Fed. He can't fire the chairman of the Fed. Why is he saying he's not going to?
Yeah.
So, and then why is he saying this after having a public spat with him for 3 months? So anyway, that was some Fed news today. Now includes the president opining on whether today he's going to fire the Fed chairman.
Yeah, and I think news is still coming out, but I know that there might have been a meeting with President Trump and Republicans sort of showing a letter of his interest in firing him. So, to your overriding point, we live in interesting times, and I think that we got to just play it day by day, week by week with a lot of the new development.
Yeah. So another big macro one I would say is war fears quieted. And so, it was very, very tense and concerning when Israel and Iran were sending pretty ferocious blows back and forth. And that in and of itself is pretty awful. But given the region and the nature of the conflict, there was great concern that this could escalate. So it could escalate into Iran attacking U.S. bases. There's many U.S. military bases all around Iran. It could lead to the Houthis shutting down the Red Sea to certain kinds of traffic, which has happened in the recent past, and which the U.S. Navy was not effective at stopping, and it could expand even further than that. And we saw some very visible support for Iran from Russia and China, among other things, with China getting much of its oil from Iran. And so, this could become a wider regional war. It could shut down global trade. Iran also, by its geopolitical nature, controls the Strait of Hormuz, because half of the Strait of Hormuz runs along the coast of Iran. And so you could have the Strait of Hormuz shut, you could have the Red Sea shut, and therefore the Suez Canal shut, and you could have China and Russia getting involved. And so I think we've seen war fears quieted, and that has buoyed the market as well. And then there's a really odd thing waiting in the background, which is that in the economic cycle, you almost never get to skip a recession. And so we had a recession due in the Biden years, and then that seems to have been pushed off. And I remember there's some really good economists at Fidelity that I follow, and they are always talking about where we are in the business cycle. And in Biden, part luck, part design, he managed to push off a recession. And that was partly pushed off because he was spending heavily on two wars, war in Ukraine and war in Israel and Gaza. And that pushed off a recession to land in Trump's lap. But now, the question is, you almost never get to skip a recession. And so are we going to see that recession land in Trump's first months, or somehow do we get to postpone it further or skip it? And I don't know what to say. I'm not seeing recession signs other than job loss, but it's job loss in an economy that's moving and that is seeing stock market prices go up. And the job loss is for multiple reasons, but some of it's claimed to be because of AI, of software developers doing AI. So I guess I like to make public calls on issues like this, and I guess I don't know whether we're going to see a recession in the next, call it 6 months. Do you have any thoughts on is the latest recession going to hit in the next 6 to 12 months?
I think, for most of the people that I follow, I think we're overdue. I think, with that same framework, a broken clock is right twice a day. If I were a betting man, I would say not in the next 6, but I would look to 12. But, as my wife knows, I've been, expecting a recession for probably the last, 8 years. So it's interesting times. Again, I think, certain events can actually catalyze a lot of things to snowball into what I think a lot of people are expecting. And to our earlier topic, the political landscape is not doing us any favors for unanticipated events transpiring.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so now we're going to shift on to chatting about the environment for fundraising, consolidation, and M&A and IPOs. And for our live audience, feel free to throw in any questions about the macro environment or the environment for fundraising, consolidation, etc. So I guess I'll start by saying that the All In podcast had a guest who called that the IPO window is open. So that's good to hear. I think that I heard it first on their show. And of course, in digital health, we had the prominent IPOs of Omada and Hinge, and they went moderately well, not catastrophically. But it's not clear, if there's an appetite for more. You really, and the biggest signal is just that the NASDAQ is at record highs. That means investors want more product, they want more IPOs. And then IPOs are a singular animal. And so if IPOs routinely dip in price, then the kinds of investors who buy them, the best investor is a long-only mutual fund that takes a big position in the book of the IPO as it goes public and agrees to hold it for a long time in return for having been given that early access. That's the best investor. And are they making money from their IPOs? Are they confident in seeing maybe 15% lift for the year in their stock? And that's not clear yet. If that is the case, then you could see a lot more mutual funds want to invest in IPOs. And so it's not clear yet. But the fact that the NASDAQ's at record highs is a good sign. I think you'll see, what we really want to see is a famous tech company or a famous healthcare company go public and do spectacularly well. That is what would, and people are saying that that's going to be SpaceX or Stripe is going to be who that is. And there's no early word that they are going public, but it would be something that big. And then, interestingly, we've seen some speculation in the trades about who might go public next. And I'm hearing Maven has filed an S, and Alliday, Datavant, Transcarent, and Verta. Those are some of the ones. All prominent companies, all unicorns, all all with top management teams, all backed by the very best VCs. Interesting and good. What I find interesting, by the way, is that this is not the list that a year ago everyone was saying would be the next companies to go public in digital health. So I didn't see Datavant on that list. I didn't see Transcarent on that list. Well, Transcarent's an interesting vehicle. It's Glenn Tullman doing sort of maybe you could call it a SPAC or a roll-up or something. But this is not the list that we saw that was likely to IPO a year ago. But there's 20 digital health unicorns rumored to IPO. There's 100 digital health unicorns out there. And so it's definitely and the capital wants to get out in about 7 years. And for a lot of these, the capital has been in there for over 10 years. And so the capital really wants to get out. Any thoughts on IPOs?
It's just interesting times. I think to your point, there's a lot of different types of companies, both in healthcare and just broadly technology. And I think there's definitely a lot of investors just waiting on the sidelines to see if if the window does open or stays open and what that sort of resilience is. I think to your point, how that stock performs durationally and not just within that sort of initial window is really a testament to the fundamentals of the company. And I think certain of these companies, have those fundamentals to actually weather the public market sentiments and certain, don't, and just have that pressure to find some liquidity. So it's going to be interesting to see how that tale of two cities plays out, over the coming quarters.
Yeah, thanks. And then fundraising. So I think one of the key metrics for our sector is fundraising. And in the past, in the 2021 in the 2021 timeframe, fundraising was too easy. There was too much money being raised, too much company entry, too much product entry into the field. And now fundraising has really become a lot tougher and has left a lot of digital health companies in challenging situations, and some of them unable to raise or having to reach much more difficult commercial milestones or getting much lower valuations. And in public markets, we've seen companies, trade as high as 15 to 20 times revenue in the past. And now we're seeing public companies trading at 4 times revenue or 0.5 times revenue. It's just that's a huge swing just in the last 5 years in those. And I think I'm noticing it's mid-July, and I'm noticing the last 2 weeks, there definitely has been weak fundraising for young digital health companies. And so that's partly a July phenomenon, but I would say that it's weak compared to July a year ago. But I think what we're seeing is a continuing Trump pause. So the Trump pause was partly initially just from cuts to government, and then it was also due to tariffs. And now there could be somewhat of a pause due to the one big beautiful bill. But this uncertainty, and the way this works is that VCs have to put money to work, and CEOs have to raise money and are often in really tough situation needing to raise money quickly. And then And also product buyers have to buy pharma companies who buy software have to buy software. But what happens is that the uncertainty happens. Maybe the pharma company is worried that it's going to see that pharma drugs are going to have pricing pressure. They're not going to have much cash on the books next year because they didn't bring in as much cash. And so then the pharma company cuts back a little bit on buying tech. And so then the VCs are supposed to make some Series A investments, and then they say, well, we're not in a rush. We can just wait 3 months and then we'll know more in 3 months. We'll see where things wind up and we'll know more in 3 months. And then CEOs then are like, oh crap, I'm talking to VCs and I'm sensing they're going slow and they're less interested and they're not willing to they're not getting excited and they're not willing to commit. And so that's the trump. So what would you say if you just were to look at the last, call it 4 weeks to 12 weeks, what do you see in terms of VC interest in early stage funding?
Yeah, I think broadly there's definitely been a recalibration in digital health capital raising. I think for the businesses that have, clear cost savings potential, durable outcomes, enterprise grade execution, there's still money out there. I would definitely say that no entrepreneur or no founder ever thinks it's easy. Even in I guess the good old days, maybe a little bit less friction. I'm not quite sure to your point on, the seasonality of fundraising, venture capitalists. I think, stereotypically always like to take off July and August. I don't know if they're taking longer summer holidays, this year round, just given the uncertainty in the broader environment. I think the new legislation, the big beautiful bill has definitely put, an uncertainty cloud over the entire market, especially the Medicaid market, as information on that, becomes sort of digested. So it's an interesting environment to navigate. I think certain companies are able to weather that storm. I think people have seen this coming. I also think one area that isn't getting, I guess, not many people sort of think too much about is even on the capital allocator side. Not many people might have as much money. The capital that's been raised is in, very few hands relatively. The sort of earlier stage investors, either are having trouble raising their follow-on vehicles or trying to be very judicious in allocating their existing, probably somewhat limited, cash situation. So there's a lot of dynamics at play here. Either way, it doesn't bode well for earlier stage founders with businesses that are still, seasoning.
Yeah, really good point. And Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz spoke to this issue. I thought it was very controversial what he had to say, but it starts with that I'd say since 2009, we saw big institutional investors increase their allocation to venture capital, and they are LPs in venture capital. And so then that meant that existing funds that are families of funds started new funds. And instead of maybe starting a $300 million fund every 4 years, they would raise a $500 million fund every 3 years. And they grew much bigger. And then top partners and other and eccentric CEOs would go and start funds. Usually they start like $100 million fund. And so you had this massive entry of VCs into the sector. And this is compared with, I think that someone said that after the dot-com bust, in the years after the year 2000, there were a handful of VCs in Silicon Valley did all the consumer tech investing in America with a handful of VCs. And this, in digital health, there grew to be over 400 VCs during this time period. And that makes it gives a lot of choice to young companies to raise money.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an issue that was happening. But now a lot of these funds are trying to raise next funds. They're supposed to put their money to work in a limited period of time, and then they raise. And then if they are successful, they get to do it again, and they raise the next fund. And as that's happening, a couple things are happening. One is that those big institutional investors, they are now allocating away from alternate investment assets and venture capital and digital health venture capital. So they're saying, "Gosh, I can get 5% in a U.S. Treasury or 10% in a blue chip, corporate bond. Why would I lock my money away for 7+ years in venture capital, which hasn't been returning as well lately?" So they're getting institutional investors are allocating away. But also, if you were unlucky and you had your first chance to be a VC in 2021 and you put all your money to work on stocks in 2021, 2022, then you were putting your money to work in companies at valuation levels of 15 times revenue. And now the same companies are trading at 4 times revenue.
Yep.
And so your track record looks terrible. and then you've put your $100 million fund to work, and now it's time to go raise a next fund with the only track record that you have, and you're hoping you can by not writing down your prior investments, maybe. They still look nice. And so there were some news stories about this that said that of B2B funds in Silicon Valley. So a lot of people will compare digital health, which sells enterprise software into enterprises, to B2B. And so in B2B, young funds that invested significantly in the 2021 to 2022 timeframe, they said that 50% of those funds will not be able to raise a next fund and will close down with their prior fund. So we're looking at a really tough situation. And those people, it's not easy to go get a next venture job at another fund when that happens. So that's a tough situation, and that may be happening to those 400 funds in digital health as well. So yeah, that's is a concern. And so that means young companies raising money. It's actually hard to know who to go to, because a lot of these kinds of returns, they're never made within the returns that venture funds make and report to LPs are either never made public, or they're made public with a very significant delay, or they're made public in a way that blurs issues like a specific partner at a successful fund may be an unsuccessful partner, but you can't know that from the outside.
Yeah.
Anyway, but any thoughts on, and so what Mark Andreessen says is that in the future, there's going to be mega funds and tiny boutique funds, but everything in the middle is going to go away. And the mega funds will, and of course, guess who he's counting himself as being part of? Obviously, he's in the mega fund that's going to make it. And so mega funds would be funds that have plenty of cash sloshing around for support with corporate development and marketing, which some of the funds offer that kind of support to new companies. But also he threw in, they have support in the form of lobbying. So in tech used to be about selling software tools into big industry. Increasingly, tech is now tech-enabled services, where if you're Uber, you're not selling logistics software to taxi companies, you're selling rides. If you're One Medical Group, you're not selling EMR software to medical practices, you're selling care visits with doctors. And that means that they're going to face normal lobbying opposition in Washington to what they're doing, because doctors are already a big established lobby in Washington and might not want a tech-enabled services company backed by $500 million of Silicon Valley capital coming into their sector, automating things and shaking it up and cutting prices. So anyway, so that's an interesting claim that Andreessen Horowitz made, and he's digging at all the famous venture funds. So there's many famous venture funds who are not going to try to be a super mega fund, and they can't go backwards and be a tiny boutique fund. And so Andreessen is putting a marker in the sand that the way it's going to be in the future is that all those famous mid-sized funds are going to be gone in the future.
Yeah, one of my investors, Austin Walters at Springtide, actually shared in the chat, so we can share it maybe with the LinkedIn audience, wrote a post about sort of this lack of diversification, or sort of the bellwether situation. And, I definitely agree that the sea is sort of, the tide is going out in terms of the broader industry, and, fewer hands are actually getting that capital. I think the other dynamic to your point, going back to maybe our first, set of topics, for the lack of sort of IPO window and liquidity events, is driving, besides the multiple compression that's happened over the last few years, sort of that lack of exit, or lack of liquidity, is driving sort of that lack of ability to raise subsequent vehicles. I think this idea of sort of the greater fool theory, continues to play out. If the music stops and there's there's no chairs left, how do you continue to sort of go? I think a lot of things are changing, especially, it won't be a show if we don't mention Gen AI and sort of some of the other dynamics happening in the market. But I think at the end of the day, and especially in our sector, data is going to win out. And so I think for the investors that are able to outperform sort of indexes or sort of, comparables, they're always going to, or going to have a better shot at raising these additional capital vehicles and funds. So it is going to be interesting, but I think we do run the risk of sort of that lack of diversification, sort of new ideas, novel approaches, given the broader concentration that's happening in the capital allocator space.
Well, thank you. And so now also moving on to M&A and consolidation. The digital health sector has had over entry, and it also has had over entry of companies, over entry of products since I would say since 2009. 2009 was the beginning of the Fed's ZERP period. And so there's analysts have long predicted, me among them, that we will see consolidation in M&A, and it's needed. And in some cases, there's also been market maturity as well, which also naturally drives consolidation as well. So that's true in employer health tech and in provider tech and in some other areas. And so, but we saw some signs like Transcarent buying Accolade, and we also saw Virgin Pulse buy HealthComp and become Personify. And people heralded those moves as the beginning of the consolidation wave. And I'm still not seeing a major consolidation. And then also Trump came in and said, bad Lena Khan, put her, stopped at the mega cap level. And so, but I'm going to start M&A at the mega cap level again. Probably that had a psychological effect on reducing M&A in digital health, but not much of a real legal effect on reducing M&A because the deals were so small in digital health compared to the mega cap deals that Clinicom was focusing on. But I still expect M&A and consolidation to pick up, but I don't see it necessarily. I don't know why we're not seeing it. But there is an apocalyptic doom scenario as to why we're not seeing it. But I can dive into the doom scenario. But what do you see? Do you think that, so I'm saying that the environment is primed for more, but we have not seen the pickup that we expected. But I think the environment is still primed for more M&A and consolidation. And I think we will see it in the second half of the year. So would you agree with that, or do you see it differently? And then I can get into my doom scenario.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this doom scenario, but I agree. I think the market has been waiting a while for, the increase in activity on that consolidation, front. I'm expecting that activity to pick up. I mean, we are evaluating as a company, a number of different types of opportunities. I think the other dynamic that I think is hindering that acceleration is something that we talked on earlier, in that there's a lot of sort of legacy funds that have certain investments and the unwillingness to realize where those investments should be priced. And this sort of attitude of sort of zombie-like companies or opportunities where they're doing fine or well, and hoping the market can help to increase that multiple or increase those options on the exit side. And so at some point, I think the rubber is going to meet the road on some of these opportunities. Some of them will be able to get to the next level and next stratosphere, and others will have to pursue other strategic paths. So I definitely see that picking up over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, so to throw that in there, if you were to cycle back 2 years ago when rates had gone up, a lot of people said we'll see a pickup in M&A activity. 2 years ago, we did not see a pickup in M&A activity. And part of what was happening was that CEOs and boards did not want to acknowledge that their multiple had come down a lot. So they had raised a lot of money at a high multiple, and they thought, rates can just flip back down to zero, and then valuation multiples will flip back up to high, and then we can resume where we were before. And that didn't happen. And so I would say that has stopped. That has stopped happening now. And management teams of small companies that would sell are now willing to sell at low multiples in general. You may see some interference at the board level, some irrational interference at the board level, where a board member is thinking, I got to raise my next fund before this company can take a down round, or it's going to hurt my career for this company to take a down round. That's an irrational interference by a board member. You may see a little bit of that. A new issue has happened, which is that for there to be a transaction, the seller has to want to sell and the buyer has to want to buy. In theory, buyers do want to buy, but they wouldn't buy it at 15 times revenue, but they might buy it now at 8 times revenue or something like that. And so in theory, you ought to be able to find a price. But one of the things that's happening now is that the buyer, so who are the buyers? The buyers are big vendors or industry incumbents or big tech incumbents. So Oracle could be a buyer, for example. So a big vendor would be like Teladoc, a big incumbent might be like HCA, and a big tech might be like Oracle or Google. And but when it comes to the big vendor or the big incumbent, they're having trouble raising money, or there's uncertainty around raising money. So the seller has to want to sell. Now the seller wants to sell. The buyer has to be able to buy. And so the buyer then goes out to do something, to do what? To issue stock to make an acquisition, to issue debt to make an acquisition. But they're having a little bit of trouble with that as well. And so that's another thing holding us back. The doom scenario has to do with another outlandish claim by Andreessen Horowitz. And so not only did they say that there's going to be mega VC firms and tiny boutique firms, and everyone else in the middle is going to be wiped out, according to Andreessen Horowitz, but they also say that every single company in the world is going to go bankrupt because they're all going to be driven out of business by AI native companies that are being founded right now. And so your defense contractor, Lockheed Martin, they'll be gone in 15 years, and they'll be replaced by AI native companies. And your big tech, your Microsoft and Oracle, unless they have reinvented themselves, that they're going to be wiped out by AI native companies being born right now. Your telehealth companies, your hospital companies are going to be wiped out. Now, healthcare is actually really good at protecting incumbents and having incumbents not be dislodged. And so that this may be stuff that doesn't apply as well to healthcare. But that is part of the idea, is that there ought to be a lot of M&A happening. So what does that M&A mean? It means savvy capital gets behind a leader and backs the leader to go, and it means you have a subcategory with 9 formerly well-funded venture-backed vendors all racing to sell software tools and sell them into some industry like employer benefit leader or hospital CIO. And then within those 9 companies, there's a leader, and the leader goes and gets savvy capital to back them, and then they go and they buy a couple of the other companies in their sector, and then they become the overwhelming market leader. They build a suite, they solve a larger suite enterprise problem for the buyer, etc. So that's a model. But if there's suddenly new AI native companies in the sector rapidly building and rapidly selling, then that takes the wind out of that. So it causes the savvy capital to say, "Hold on a second." That is the doom scenario that I mentioned. It's a doom for the 9 formerly well-funded vendors in the sector who did the hard work of discovering the product feature functionality and the customer base, only to set it up nicely for the AI native company to come along with a single $30 million fundraise last year to come along and sort of build software faster and have better feature functionality that can't be easily duplicated by the existing incumbents. Anyway, that was the
Gotcha.
that, or the prospect of that, could cause savvy capital to not back a roll up in the sector. So
I think there's a lot of uncertainty with both how companies are currently innovating and also the up and coming companies. So I think there is a dynamic that plays out. We have integrated Gen AI into all of our aspects of our operations, but I think it's a continuing process to even just stay up to speed and up to date. I mean, the market and industry changes every 2-3 weeks almost. It's an interesting dynamic to even think, if you think about company consolidation, there's a school of thought that we're not going to be around as a species by 2030. So, due to Gen AI. So I hear you on the company consolidation. I think there's almost an existential consolidation that we should evaluate as well, according to some. But it's, again, interesting times. You're not wanting for any sort of tranquility or predictability these days.
Well, so in terms of our show plan, I'm going to skip some stuff just to save time. But in the trade journal news, I have a note here that Mattel has introduced a Barbie with type 1 diabetes. And she comes, this is not a joke, this is as reported by Moby Health News. And she comes with a continuous glucose monitor and an insulin pump. And so I think that's a signal that digital health has made it. We used to be we used to be trying to prove ourselves, but now this shows that we've moved on up and we've hit the big time. So, any thoughts on any trade journal news you wanted to call your attention to, or reaction to that?
I'm speechless. Actually, Googling it now, I see it. Without having any prior context, maybe the attempt is to create awareness and understanding. I think that specifically with type 1 diabetes, I can see how, certain perspectives would find, even just that offensive in certain respects. I'm not going to, quickly opine on that. I was not aware of that. I'll have to ask my wife about it from a clinical perspective of how that's playing out in her community. Never ceases to surprise what the consumer market does with that. But I think to your point, I think, just given the prevalence of healthcare, both good and bad, I think there is an integration and the blurring of lines between the consumer market and the traditional healthcare market. And that might be also where we're going, just from a trajectory perspective, the focus on longevity. and this sort of merging of those, traditionally two very distinct worlds. Even most recently, I saw it very briefly in terms of the FDA sending a notice to Whoop on their heart rate monitoring, now being classified possibly as a medical device. So we are seeing those lines blurring, and I would think with the overlay of Gen AI, that acceleration and consolidation is probably just going to happen ever more rapidly.
Yeah, thank you. I hadn't heard about the Whoop news, and I'll have to look into that as well. So I know that that is something that companies like Whoop, and I used to cover Fitbit, and I knew the management team at Fitbit. They think about it all the time. It's a matter of great interest, great concern to them. Do they choose to go down a FDA regulated pathway, or perhaps not go down a pathway? And I remember early Fitbit, they made a decision to call their heart rate variability monitoring consumer grade, but not clinical grade. And so they don't call it diagnostic, they don't call it clinical grade, they don't say you can make a diagnosis from it. And they'll even say things like, well, you would never use it to to monitor a condition, but you can use it to compare it to itself. For example, if it says your heartbeat has increased in speed, that's probably accurate compared to itself. But I know that in some of these cases with these devices, they actually can spot serious heart problems in patients, but they're not diagnostic grades. They can't actually tell the patient, we think that you have atrial fibrillation. And so what they do instead is they will actually send you a notice that you should see a doctor. But if you could talk to them, which you're not allowed to talk to them, but if you could talk to them, they would actually tell you your correct diagnosis. But all they can do, because they're consumer grade, is tell you to see a doctor. And then there was at least one case where one of these companies was too sensitive, and so they sent a whole bunch of late middle-aged men to their
Oh,
doctors
wow.
saying, my device tells me to see my doctor. And that, caused a whole bunch of middle-aged men to spin up a lot of time with primary care physicians and cardiologists because their wrist-based device was too set. That's another problem with clinical grade, that there's no real accountability for that the way there would be for a med tech company. And then not only do you have to figure out how you position it and what you say about it, but then the FDA can decide later to come in and change things on you. So
Yeah, it's a hard line to navigate, and I think to your point, with technology improving so rapidly and the wearable dynamic, it is fascinating to see how that develops. I mean, we have evaluated a number of wearable devices, and some, very popular consumer, focused, devices aren't even FDA approved at a basic level. You can't sort of reimburse, with codes, and you can't even, rely clinically on that data. But it is very sort of good, accurate data according to our, statistics and third party statistics. So, I think those are some of the barriers within healthcare right now. Let's name, one of many. Just the pace of innovation and the regulatory environment, has not, kept in lockstep.
very interesting. So I thought I'd throw in, one of our favorite parts of the show is talking about what is the technology that you use in your daily life that's affordable, that our audience could use, that has led to a great improvement in your life. And what I'll throw in there is that there's this new generation of what I'll call mini power banks, mini power stations. And so one of them that calls itself a power bank, that means it's small, is the Anchor 737. I think it's on sale right now. It's a bestseller. It is the size of like a baton used in a marathon, a little bit smaller than that, maybe. And what I'm going to say is have one for your office and then one for your car. So why would you have one for your car? And I think the Anchor one is lithium ion based, which means it works in all weather, including freezing weather, which is important. And so the reason in your car is that your car can keep it charged all the time. So imagine having this battery that is always charged in your car if you have a car-centric life. And so then it's always in your car, it's always fully charged because it was just because you just drove your car for 35 minutes and it charged in your car. And it charged by USB in your car, not by those old cigarette lighters in your car. And then it's fully charged where you get to. And then also it means that if you need to charge your own phone when you're in your car, but your car is off, now you can charge your phone in your car because you're charging it off of the Anchor, which itself is going to be charged the next time you drive your car. Anyway, there's that. There's also the Anchor C200, which is a bit bigger than the Anchor 737, and it uses what's it called, LiFePO4 batteries, lithium ferrous phosphate, something like that, batteries. And these ones, you're not supposed to charge them when it's freezing outside. So they're less good for your car because your car will be freezing from time to time. But just really really amazing. There's a new generation out there. And I would say have one to live in your car so that your car runs electrical apps and charges stuff when your car's not running, and it's always charged in your car. So you don't have to bring it inside to charge it. So that's my tip for the audience. And Sloan, do you have any tech that you like?
Well, I agree. You can never have enough power banks. I love my, well, I guess they call it a MagGo, but it clips onto the back magnetically to power it, as sort of an extension with the depth of the phone. Never leave home without it, especially when I'm, in New York City walking around. The other one, and we've started to, again, sort of integrate it across all work streams of the company, and I use it a lot in my personal life, is just a Gen AI, personal assistant, helping to optimize, calendars, a mini consultant, to help, summarize documents, strategy, communications. I think, I've embedded it in most of my communication streams. And that has proved invaluable. I probably should have it run, analytics on just response times and whatnot, but it has been a huge time saver and an optimization engine, and just communicating across the company, but also optimizing and consolidating, personal and professional sort of schedules and that networking.
Very cool. And for our audience, feel free to throw in any technologies that have improved your life. So next, moving on to upcoming conferences. So the one I'll focus on here is just people are already talking about health in Las Vegas. So for digital health in general, this is an excellent investor conference. A growing number of investors are going to health in October in Las Vegas, not JP Morgan in January in San Francisco. And it's an enjoyable conference. The programming is interesting, and there's many digital health investors there. I'd say that the strengths of it are in provider tech companies selling into providers, payer tech companies selling into payers. I think it's a little weaker on pharma tech, but it wants to be better on pharma tech. But it's tech vendors selling into the pharma, but not FDA risk stuff, just selling enterprise software, automation software into pharma. And then it's a little weak on pharma tech, and then it's also a little weak on FDA risk stuff, med tech, prescription digital therapeutics, but it's trying to get better there. So this is a central investor conference for our sector. People are already talking about it. But interestingly, I believe it's now been sold to a new conference production company, and that's usually a bad sign. So usually some kind of genius is the guy who created a conference from nothing. Steve Jobs created the iPhone, but it's harder to create a conference because with a conference, you have these different stakeholders and they all have to agree at the same time to commit to you. It's not like you just have to build a hardware device. You have to get different stakeholders to commit at the same time. And so it's a marketplace, and that's especially hard. And then that genius leaves and starts a new company. And then the new owners are definitely going to take it in a new direction, even if they're trying to have minimal changes. And you wonder how that's going to go. But there isn't really a competitor that is all sectors and venture investor focused like this one. So I'm looking into, I always have a horrendous experience on the flight out of there because there's no good flights and they're taken by the time I stop procrastinating and get to it. And so I'm actually looking into this now in July instead of doing it in September when everyone else is going to look at it. So, Sloan, any thoughts on health or other conferences you want to call attention of to our audience?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly on health. It is a main event for a lot of different stakeholders. It is a mad dash to the airport to leave. So yeah, book your flights early. We'll have a team there. And I think, if you go in sort of knowing what you want to get out of it and be proactive with the meetings, I think you and I even sat down at last year's health. You can really, knock a lot of pins down in one throw if you're, conscientious about it. For us as an organization, we plan to be at the Midwest Business Group on Health in late September. That event, Digital Health New York, has a fantastic summit, Bunny, and that whole organization does a great job. So, we'll be there in mid-September. We also, play obviously in the diabetes obesity space, at an event with the ADA and the state of diabetes in New York in early November. I think there's probably a number of other conferences and events that we'll attend over the fall. It's going to be a busy fall. I've been looking at my travel schedule, and I think there's not one week that I'm either on a plane or somewhere.
So I know the people behind DHNY, Bunny Ellerin. what is good about this summit? I know that it has a New York lens, which is cool. It probably also has a pharma lens, or at least things Bunny does have often had pharma lenses, pharma tech, that sort of thing. What do you like about DHNY?
Yeah, Bunny does a great job, and her whole team does a great job curating the discussions, the panel topics, and also the attendees. I find that the caliber of the attendees, decision makers, thought leaders, that really help to catalyze more interesting conversations than at most conferences. So we've really, enjoyed, being a sponsor on a number of her events. We actually helped sponsor a subgroup called the Obesity Working Group, and we did an event at NYU with DHNY a few months ago. So there's a lot of novel approaches and novel conversations that we're able to participate in with our forums.
That's great. And then also there's the Primary Ventures New York City Summit, which people love to go to, but it's invitation only. It's hard to get an invite to it. Last year it was in September. They moved the date, and it was in September of last year. And I looked before the show and I couldn't find the date, so they're keeping it a secret. So this is definitely going to be worth trying to crash this party if the date's a secret and it's invitation only. And so just for our audience, if you know someone at Primary Ventures, this one has a good reputation, and it may be in September again this year. Well, great. Well, and so then personal notices. So this is a chance to tell our audience of whether you're going to be speaking at an event or participating in an event in the future. And so for our audience, I just wanted to mention that I'm doing a longevity leadership brunch in Bar Harbor coming up this Sunday. So that'll be, and so we're bringing together leaders in the longevity sector, combining both the software longevity and also longevity biotech and healthy living and that sort of thing. And that's going to be Sunday, July 20th at 11:30 a.m. on the water in Bar Harbor. So email me, reply to the emails about this show to my email address and ask for the link, and if you're going to be in Bar Harbor or live in Maine or that sort of thing. Sloan, any availabilities or personal notices?
I apologize. This is the one homework assignment I don't think I did a great job on. I think we do a great job via LinkedIn with either under Flight Health or myself or Catherine. We'll list out sort of as upcoming events come up of where we're speaking, traveling to. But we'll look forward to seeing people there.
That's great. So now we move on to the second half of our show, the revolution in obesity care. New therapies are shaking up the super category of obesity and diabetes care, but it's not enough to just take a drug. And so I guess I wanted to just set up for you, Sloan, that over the decades, the treatment of obesity has become an enormous sector, many different approaches. It's hard to find one that works for everyone. Same with diabetes. It's become the treatment of the care for diabetes, treatment for diabetes, become a very large industry. And then in the middle of this, a giant rock is thrown in the pond, and that is GLP-1s. And so, how did the obesity and diabetes care industry get to the point that it was, and how is it doing? And then now GLP-1s, is it enough to just take a drug? Is calling up a telephone care service and getting a GLP-1 prescription, is that enough? Or where does the sector go from here? What do GLP-1s mean, and how do they and how are they going to shake up these two very large sectors in our economy, and what's next?
A lot of good questions. We could spend hours and hours talking about it. I'll say in short, no, it needs more than just a very effective and revolutionary sort of therapeutic. So, for us as an organization, it's about the broader ecosystem to support what that care model looks like. But just taking a step back for a second and giving more context to it's been a fascinating ride since starting the company with my wife, Catherine, in 2017, 2018. Her mentor and one of our co-founders, Dr. Louis Aroni, has been on the forefront of obesity medicine his entire career. Graduating medical school from Cornell in the 80s, he actually set up, one of the first, weight-focused programs and obesity centers, in the US or probably in the world, and helped to discover the key hormone leptin when he was at Rockefeller, has been a lead principal investigator on all the clinical trials that have led to all the weight indicated medications, even the most recent ones like tirzepatide, and helped to co-found the American Board of Obesity Medicine. So, working with him over the last almost a little under a decade. It's been fascinating, as he says, to go from everybody thinking he was a kook or a quack, understanding the pathophysiology of obesity, to now having these newer therapeutics, really catalyze understanding and interest in a care model that he has helped to pioneer. And so the advancement, that has come, and people I don't think really appreciate how long GLP-1s have actually been in the market. He and my wife, Catherine, was the first clinical fellow in obesity medicine at Weill Cornell about 10 years ago. And when she came home to tell me that she was going to be the first clinical fellow in obesity medicine, I was just floored. How are you? Obesity was a big issue 10 years ago. How is Cornell just starting a fellowship program? And foundationally, one of the inefficiencies in this space is that there are very few providers or clinicians that really focus on this as a comprehensive subspecialty. She's still one of fewer than 200 fellowship-trained obesity specialists in the U.S. Dr. Roney, who helped to start the American Board of Obesity Medicine, the accreditation body in the U.S., there are about 8,500 board certified physicians, for the 180, 200 million Americans who, technically, according to standard of care guidelines, need this type of care. Those two lines will never intersect. And so that dramatic supply shortage has caused a lot of misunderstanding and basically poor clinical intervention to, robo-prescribe or chuck over the fence, however you want to describe some of the current, offerings in the space, to equate, the clinical treatment of weight, which is a very complicated chronic disease functioning on multiple pathways, neurologically, hormonally, metabolically, with just prescribing Wegovy. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is that knee-jerk response to just, throw a GLP-1 at someone without really doing a comprehensive evaluation, having a strong ecosystem and support system for that patient durationally, has led to very poor and dismal outcomes for most. There have been countless studies from Prime Therapeutics, Evernorth, basically just showing very, very poor outcomes. 20, 30, 40% adherence in the first year. I think Prime recently came out with a 2 and almost 3 year now study, showing almost 8% adherence in 3 years. And that's not even being able to measure probably what would be suboptimal clinical outcomes. And so that framework is what we've been navigating with Flight over the last, 6, 7 years. And most recently, as we stood up our own clinical services affiliate, 4 or 5 years ago, to provide this care due to that dearth of providers, to really prove out what great care in this modality looks like. And we recently published our data, state of Connecticut data, showing about 86% adherence, really attractive resource optimization, and just really strong durability over, to really, again, for us as an organization, show what that economic impact is ultimately. Because, at the end of the day, it's a financial sort of decision for most, unfortunately. And to really optimize what that care model is, you really have to understand the flip side of the coin. And we've done a great job demonstrating that to our current clients. We have a number of new clients that are coming online shortly that we're excited to announce. And I think going forward, the market is going to become even noisier. And I think that's where a lot of people really don't understand. Right now, there are essentially two options, right? Different indications, but Novo has a drug that is either Ozempic and for diabetes, or Wegovy for weight, the Eli Lilly drug tirzepatide, Mounjaro or Zepbound. There's two different options essentially. There are 100 in late stage clinical trials. And so to expect someone who's not a specialist to do a comprehensive evaluation, have that ecosystem of support, and then figure out which medication of the, let's call it, be easy and say 20 is most impactful for that patient, is setting that provider up for failure. And so that's the opportunity we see right now within our space, this massive reframing of where the clinical treatment of weight fits within these existing, other related chronic conditions, other, care pathways, other modalities, and how to really optimize through technology and clinical services how that care is delivered, quantifying that impact, and really, repeating that, and optimizing that as we, continue to scale.
So what does it look like for someone to have, the title of the show is about obesity care. So let's focus on obesity for a moment instead of diabetes. And so for obesity, what does it look like for someone to get an outstanding program that both understands them and then perhaps gives them a prescription to a GLP-1, but also helps them with adherence and also helps them avert some of the side effects, and the most famous of which is muscle loss, which that's never good, especially in older people. And so what does an excellent program look like?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think the exciting part is that it's a continually evolving solution, especially to, I think, the first part of our conversation with technology, how to create that personalized, emotionally layered solution that draws that patient in to give them an understanding of what great care looks like, and really create durability in that. So for us as an organization, it's really starts with understanding and empathy, and education. So we take a lot of time to explain to all our patients, and quite frankly, even the provider groups who work with, to other clinicians, that obesity is a chronic, refractory, very complicated disease, and it's not their fault. The world we currently live in has set them up, set everybody up for failure. We live in a very obesogenic environment. So that translates to highly processed, calorically dense, cheap food that we got very good at manufacturing, in the world wars, which was the objective. And, the unfortunate consequence of that is an environment that have great tasting, really poor, food that's not great for us, and an environment that is highly sedentary. And if you think of us, as a species, we evolved, quite remarkably to not starve. 100, 200, 500, years ago, that was our biggest concern. It wasn't McDonald's on every corner, or, a pizza in the freezer whenever I want it. It was, I don't know when I'm going to find another moose to kill, or whatever. So, when we, have these constellations of environment behavior that contribute to weight gain, and what a lot of people don't know, that 15 to 20% of the current obesity epidemic is what they call drug induced. So a medication or an over the counter aid has weight gain as a side effect, for that individual. So that sort of confluence of different contributors leads people to continue to gain weight. And so even if you start to lose weight through, let's call it a caloric restriction, certain diet, P90X, activity, if you lose 10% of your body weight, your body actually reduces the various hormones that regulate, that weight regulation 60%. And so it goes into starvation mode, even if you are, and have excess weight. So I know I'm diverting, but I know I was, getting distracted a little bit. This is the consequences of being married to an obesity specialist. I think that, really foundationally is one of the key things that a lot of organizations are missing in terms of educating the patient that this is a long-term chronic program, right? We're not here for quick fixes or easy solutions. This is your body literally fighting you, for most people, for the rest of their lives to regain the weight. And so, part of our program is doing a very comprehensive evaluation, identifying medications they might be on that are weight promoting, understanding their, behavior, eating patterns, cravings, sleep patterns, medications, medical history, really understanding everything that has led contributors to weight gain for that patient, barriers, and identifying barriers to weight loss, and then, evaluating them clinically where medication might be an option. And one of our biggest differentiators in understanding, and this goes back to sort of the foundational clinical expertise, our clinicians really don't think about a medication in terms of the brand label. They think about it in terms of the underlying mechanism of action and the pathways that medication works on, because there's a myriad of different medications that are, non-GLP-1 medications, or that work on different pathways that we deploy with our clients to not only save them money, but also help the patient in not being dependent necessarily on a GLP-1 for the rest of their life. And so it's that sort of comprehensive ecosystem where we have a behavior lifestyle intervention on top of that clinical model. Our behavior lifestyle intervention was studied at the Brigham and Women's through an 18-month PCORI randomized clinical trial that JAMA published on. And all of that is sort of wrapped into sort of this engaging technology driven ecosystem of support that that patient navigates the journey through.
And so, by the way, you mentioned where we live in an obesogenic environment. Once I was remembering my own childhood, and in my own childhood, everything was inconveniently far away, and so I had to get on my bike to go, uh, you know, 11 blocks to get to a convenience store. I had to walk several blocks to play with friends in their friends' front yard. Everything was inconveniently far away. Everything was the wrong temperature at all times. It was either too hot or too cold, including in the car. If you rolled down the window on a hot day, it was still unpleasantly hot. And then also, food was not available. So if I had only 2 spoonfuls of oatmeal in the morning and went to school, I was not seeing another bit of food until lunchtime, until the lunch ladies were putting a cheese sandwich,
Meatloaf.
yeah, a toasted cheese sandwich on my plate at lunchtime. And then if I stuck my nose in the fridge, there was some chicken in there that my mom was saving for dinner, and I better not raid that. There was some uncooked chicken in there. There's no raiding the uncooked chicken, or whatever. And today, it's all the opposite. So today, everything is convenient. We drive or have things delivered today, and the temperature is always perfect. It's always 72 degrees, and all the food you could ever wish for is within arm's reach of desire. At all times. And I don't think I could have survived that environment without putting on some serious weight if that was my environment as a 10-year-old or something. So it's just amazing. And then I don't know if you subscribe to this, but there's an evolutionary theory, which is that, as we were hunter gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years before we lived in modern civilization. And so if you had the opportunity to maybe eat a few extra bites of the auroch that you guys had killed, and then put on some weight, that was a good thing, and your body was optimized to do that, because there might not be another feast for weeks, and you might be living on playing a calorie game, living on barely enough calories between now and then. So you better pack it on, and that was considered to be a great advantage. And then today it's definitely not an advantage. You go out to dinner with friends, there's a particularly nice looking item on the menu, you eat it, and then you have way more calories in that evening than you probably should have had in that evening. And your body's grabbing it and putting it to use, storing it away in fat cells. And so, our bodies are not built for this. We live in an environment where we can control everything except our appetites. And now finally, we have the drug that can control our appetites, maybe. So.
Yeah, it's a great point, and we absolutely subscribe to that sort of evolutionary sort of pathophysiology, theory. I think what you're referencing is something called basically metabolic adaptation, or a technical term is adaptive thermogenesis, I think. But basically, as you lose weight, your body actually lowers your metabolic rate to hold on to those calories because, again, it's trying to avoid starvation. And I think there's an opportunity. It's not, our sort of approach is not sort of, this isn't going to be solved with a silver bullet. It's not a quick fix, but it's definitely a multidisciplinary, team-based, comprehensive approach to come up with ways that optimize your environment to maybe make you walk the extra block or 2 blocks, maybe, make it a little difficult. There's a book that I've been trying to find time to read called The Comfort Crisis. And I think there's truth to that. If we can actually create environments that does make it a little bit more difficult in certain ways. With that, I don't want to sort of, avoid sort of the overriding sort of need for clinical evaluation and clinical care. That is true to our DNA as an organization, everybody that I spend a lot of time with. But it's that combination where, it's fascinating. The science is still trying to understand sort of how exactly GLP-1s really work. There is parts of, I think, appetite suppressant, but they're starting to also identify sort of other things that it sort of activates or deactivates, and I'll let the clinicians, opine on that. But it is fascinating, just like as this field evolves, to your point, referencing, and you hear it a lot in terms of, the side effects from these medications. And I think what, at least according to the clinicians I, spend time with, a lot of those side effects, they feel are due to inappropriate clinical prescribing. Too high starting dosages, not monitoring side effects, even, some, certain, side effects, quote unquote, are actually just due to a rapid reduction in weight that you see with post-bariatric patients. So hair loss, you mentioned lean muscle mass reduction. It's a fascinating, a specialized field of science or medicine. Now there's even sort of a thought that it's not a question of sort of that percentage of lean muscle mass. It's the composition of that muscle mass. And, we do a number of things at the company to preserve that, but also, we're really starting to understand what that optimization looks like. And to my earlier point on the pipeline, there's some medications that actually do a lot more in the preservation of that lean muscle mass or have other pathways that it's working on that are related more to, CKD or, MASH or fatty liver. We got this question the other day from a head of benefits of a very large organization. And she asked, when GLP-1s are indicated for every other chronic disease, how is your program going to change? And quite candidly, it's not going to change that much because we sort of take that comprehensive approach, but it just shows you that reframing that is occurring to say, oh, listen, we get it. We've been trying to sort of cure sort of, the diabetes, the hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and now we can treat the obesity, which, consequently helps to address those related conditions. And you see those sort of indications, following that pervasiveness that's happening with the treatment of weight, like the indication for sleep apnea, cardiovascular risk reduction, certain neurological conditions. It's really an exciting time, to sort of both be in the trenches, but even just, watch from an academic mindset, just how rapidly this space is evolving and the true opportunity in this reframing that's going on in our space.
And so, by the way, I've also heard GLP-1s, I've heard of them spoken of as a lifestyle drug. And so the humorous context there is that San Francisco is the city that gave us LSD and marijuana as lifestyle drugs. And now the new lifestyle drug coming out of San Francisco is minor weight loss as a fashion statement using GLP-1 drugs. So I've heard that, but I've also heard it more seriously discussed as a longevity drug. So there is no drug currently approved for longevity. And usually when a new drug comes out, it's a drug for heart failure. And heart failure or some other large chronic disease. And then people speculate, is this a longevity drug because it's helping someone who's 60 and has heart failure to live longer or something? But the nature of GLP-1s as possible longevity drugs is so that there's a word game where they define a longevity drug as a drug that helps with two or more major chronic conditions associated with aging. And GLP-1s would meet that characteristic for diabetes and obesity, and they're also being looked at for other ones, sleep apnea, etc. So I wonder, do you think that, and so therefore a GLP-1 is treating something very basic that contributes to multiple chronic diseases that affect people as they grow older and contribute to their morbidity and mortality when they're aged. So what do you think of that characteristic, that characterizing GLP-1 as the first longevity drug?
I think it's completely understandable and expected. I think it's again, an interesting time. I think what the science is trying to sort of parse is it weight loss or the GLP-1 mechanism that is contributing to the amelioration of all of those related areas that you referenced there. I would, actually, I guess, caution that GLP-1 is not the first. So, metformin is actually, a very interesting medication to evaluate as well. So they're doing what they call the TAM trial, the targeting aging with metformin at Montefiore. I think it's one of the largest, it's a very interesting trial to sort of show, a number of different sort of properties of metformin that helps with essentially longevity. I think the complicating part is, metformin is generic. So finding sort of funding for a lot of these research was hard, especially sort of on that side. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I completely agree directionally where that's going in terms of, again, that GLP-1 sort of agonist, but it's going to be interesting to see how, as more drugs come to market, what specifically is causing that sort of extension of life, if you will, along what different related areas. Like obesity has been proven to directly or indirectly, cause over 200 related conditions. And so sort of that sort of attribution, complexity, gets very interesting. What's drug, what's weight loss, and I think it's a combination of the two. But I think, to your point, it's exciting. And I think it needs to be done responsibly. I think to your earlier point on lifestyle drugs, I think there has been a lot of misuse and abuse. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of dynamics from an economics perspective that, afford access to certain populations, and it makes it harder for others. From a mission perspective at the company, our focus is on the democratization of best-in-class obesity care. And again, I'd caution people to sort of just conflate the clinical treatment of weight with Wegovy or Zepbound, but more sort of a comprehensive now sort of understanding of what can be done responsibly and how that is best delivered.
That's great. So we have a question from someone in the audience. And so also for our audience, we have enough time in the show for a couple questions. And so any last questions from our audience, please type them in the chat now. Christy just asks, what do you think is next, or what do you think the next 3 to 5 years look like within this niche space? And so I guess we're referring here to GLP-1s entering the obesity care sector. There's the medical side of obesity care. There's also the consumer side, which is not medical, which is things like Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig. Maybe you could throw Noom in there as well. And suddenly it's been interrupted, or it's had a rock thrown in the pond, and the rock is GLP-1 drugs. And so what do you think the next 3 to 5 years looks like in this sector?
Yeah, it's a great question, something we think a lot about in terms of, the knock-on side effects. I would, push back that I think she used the word niche. It's 70+% of the US population. And let me be clear, that's not, should be on Wegovy or a GLP-1 even. It's according to standard of care guidelines from the American Heart Association and the Endocrinology Society that people with sort of excess weight should be evaluated clinically for the treatment of that excess weight, which can be accomplished with behavior lifestyle interventions, medications, non-GLP-1 medications, and then possibly GLP-1 medications. So again, I always try to, echo my wife in saying, let's really come at it in a more comprehensive manner. And I think that maybe goes to part of my answer to the question. I think there is going to be even an acceleration of this reframing of where this niche specialty that 70+% of the Americans and the core of the global population would benefit from, both politically, societally, economically, better productivism, lower absenteeism, sort of higher GDP growth, not to mention all the implications on the health and wellness side. But I think you're starting to see that sort of integrate across a number of different industries. I mean, I think it was Goldman put out a report, and it's a fascinating report just on sort of those second layer, third layer sort of impacts, ramifications, whether it be CPG products or
I think I remember they thought that the candy and chocolate sectors would take a devastating hit, among other things.
yeah. Or even airlines, right? The gas, like fuel consumptions, they were predicting to go down because, people were going to be later on airplanes. I mean, you can sort of spin around, in circles for a while, thinking about it. But I think it's an exciting time that I think will definitely be out of the niche realm, if not now, very shortly. That again, I think employers and payers are viewing it, instinctively, from a defensive, cost, perspective, because I think there's a duration mismatch for most payers from a coverage perspective. I think everybody agrees if this was $1, this wouldn't be a big issue. And so it's just, how do you find that right incentive model and what the crossover point is to really make this, what should be a first line intervention in primary care, and not afterthought in the last 2 minutes of a visit to say, just prescribe you medication for diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, but you should probably lose weight. That'll help with everything we just talked about. Good luck with that. I'm trying to lose weight as well as the clinician. That's the typical refrain we hear from patients. And so I think it's going to take a lot of work to really sort of, integrate that reframing. But we work with a lot of health systems that are completely on that page of reprioritizing this, even within the primary care ecosystem.
So let me just jump in to add that I think that there's a joke that people thought that the office computer was going to reduce the amount of paper usage in the office. And instead, it 10x the amount of paper usage in the office. And so, will GLP-1 drugs rapidly reduce the amount of programs for weight loss because a drug is prescribed and that's the end of the story? And I think actually it's going to be more like the example of paper, the PCN paper, which is that I think we're going to 10x the amount of GLP-1 drug prescribed, but we're also going to 10x the amount of programs around it. And so I think that for a number of reasons. One is that there's a growing number of studies coming out that GLP-1s are useful for a broad variety of indications. We mentioned earlier sleep apnea. Obesity is a major contributor to sleep apnea. You treat the obesity, you also treat the sleep apnea. And there's many more coming down the pike. And then very often the side effects, the unwanted side effects of GLP-1s are not as bad as the direct treatment benefit that you're getting. So if you lose weight but you lose muscle, the excess weight was a bigger problem than being thin and having less muscle is. And so that on a relative basis, it's worth it to take the drug. You're also going to have many new drugs entering the marketplace, and some of them may not have some of the side effects. Some of them may be better targeted at certain populations, an old demographic, a young demographic, and they're going to have more options, also more price competition. And so in non-US markets, the price of these drugs is already lower, and in the US, I think the price is going to come down as you have competition. Someone says, "Well, I can't get this premier on patent drug, but I'll go with this other drug instead." That has a similar effect. And so for all these reasons, much broader usage, people coming to terms with the side effects, more studies expanding indications, more drugs causing competition in drug pricing, etc. You're going to see a dramatic increase in the prescription of GLP-1s. And you're also going to see a dramatic increase in the prescription of programs around the GLP-1s. So it's always been an enormous challenge to keep people adherent to a drug. In the case of diabetes, you can tell people to take insulin or they'll have terrible, terrible, terrible consequences, including going blind and having your limbs amputated. And people will not take their insulin after you tell them that. So adherence is a huge challenge, and having a friendly, effective program around getting adherence. By the way, we may see pill-based GLP-1s in the future instead of that's in the works instead of injection-based GLP-1s. So that's going to remove
that's 2027.
Yeah, but that's going to remove a barrier to GLP-1s. Some people don't want to inject themselves or be injected at all. And that layer of using injections means that you need a cold supply chain and you need skilled people and you need extra cost, etc. So, and we talked about adherence, but there's also going to be fitness programs. So you want to keep someone, you want to have a clear goal that gets you the benefit without the side effects. And so you need a program that's tailored to someone. You need to keep them on that program and help them along the way. And this is what traditionally Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig and others have done, but they have largely missed the boat on mobile and on digital and mobile. And I think they've missed the boat on GLP-1s as well. So it's going to be a new generation of programs, some coming through the medical channel, the other ones coming through the consumer channel. And so I think that having a powerful drug with limited side effects, which GLP-1s are, that has produced some astonishing results that we've all seen in Hollywood stars who've taken the drug, that sort of thing. I think it's going to do for volume of drug prescriptions and also for programs around managing the use of the drug, keeping adherence, reducing side effects, delivering optimal outcomes. I think it's going to 10x the use of those. It's not going to cause it to go away. And as a result, we're going to see thinner people in our society as well. But it's going to be a struggle and a battle along the way, and so we need all of these factors functioning well. So that's my prediction for Christy. Thank you, Christy. Well, so with that, we've run out of time. But just any last just remarks summarizing it, or anything else for our audience, Sloan?
No, I think you did a great job of where we are and where we're going. I think we are in the most expensive period of the treatment of weight ever. Just supply, demand, economics, price will come down. I think it's going to take time. Orforglipron is the Lilly drug that is oral, that's coming to market or, expected to come to market, shortly. I think to your point, what is going to, I think, be the differentiator factor as the adoption of these newer therapies gets more pronounced, I actually will take the under on the prediction that there'll be more programs. I think there are actually going to be fewer programs. I mean, if you think about our program that currently treats obesity, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes, the list goes on and on. So I see a consolidation, but also with technology, I think what is the opportunity is to prove it out with data. That's what we did with our Milliman publication showing 86% adherence. I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors out there. And I think buyers are waking up to the fact that, it's from, employers, it's their data, and they now have a fiduciary duty to make sure they are making sound decisions. And the only way you do that is the analysis of the data and showing what impact they're actually having. And that's where we feel very confident as an organization to take on risk-based contracts and do more novel bases of reimbursement that I think a lot of organizations don't have the appetite to do, that I think will lead to consolidation or reduction in the number of offerings. I'm excited and on the edge of my seat, of how that's going to play out over the coming months and years. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Great, thank you. Well, so you've been listening to the Digital Health Investor Talk Show with your host, Steve Wardell, and our thanks to our guest, Sloan Saunders, founder and CEO of Flight Health. We'll be publishing this show as an episode of the Digital Health Investor Talk Show. Subscribe on Apple and Spotify and rate us. We love every 5-star review. And that's it. See you. And Sloan, thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thank you for having me.